Hi everyone, what is exposure diamond? We know that exposure triangle is a well-known concept in photography that explains the relationship between ISO and aperture and shutter speed. And these are the three fundamental settings to control the exposure. However, a newer concept, exposure diamond, expands on the basis of this concept. And the exposure diamond is built on this concept by adding another source of light. When you add another light, then you can adjust your exposure not only by ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Also, you can control the exposure of the additional light source. Now that we know that the four elements of exposure diamonds are ISO, aperture, shutter speed, and the added light source. Photographers can adjust the exposure not just by changing camera setting, but also by modifying the added light using tools like flashes, continuous light, or reflectors. Some people also argue that when you take your image to an editing software like Lightroom and you increase or decrease the exposure by using the sliders, you have created an exposure diamond. When you add another source like a reflector, a flash, or a continuous light to exposure triangle, now you have to deal not only with one exposure but two. One for the ambient light and the second one is exposure for the new light source. So when you're shooting outside and you're not using any additional light or reflector, you are mostly dealing with exposure triangle. And as soon as you add a light source or a reflector, then you're dealing with exposure diamond. This approach is especially useful in photography studios, flash photography, where modifying the lighting is as important as the camera setting. Exposure triangle is more suitable for beginners so they can understand the relationship between ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Both triangles share two key settings, ISO and aperture. These two control the ambient light and also the flash exposure. So we set him and leave him unchanged. To control each exposure separately, we can change the shutter speed to control the exposure of the ambient light and to control the exposure of the flash or continuous light or any kind of a light source. We have to change the intensity. Now let's take a few shots to demonstrate exposure diamond. I'm taking a shot of the dolphin here, but I'm exposing for the outside, for the ambient light. I'm shooting at 1/100 of a second, f8, and ISO is 100. Let's take the shot. And now I'm adding a flash. As soon as I add the flash, I'm no longer using exposure triangle, but I'm using exposure diamond. When you add a light, then instead of dealing with one exposure, you are dealing with two exposures, one for the ambient and one for the added light. I'm just going to make sure that the exposure for the doll head is the same as the exposure outside. So it's 1/100 of a second, ISO 100, and I have to have f8 as aperture. So I'm gonna measure the flash. 7.1. So I'm gonna increase it. Take another reading, f8. So I'm gonna take another shot. And I have the perfect exposure for the ambient light outside and perfect exposure for the doll head. Now let's see what happens if I change the shutter speed from 100 to 160. So the exposure for the doll head doesn't change because shutter speed's got nothing to do with the exposure of the flash. It only affects the ambient light. So I can see that I get a darker exposure for the ambient light, for the outside. So let's change it to 200. I get a darker ambient light, but the exposure of the doll head is the same. So I can do the same thing, changing the intensity of the flash. So let's do that. Let's go back to 100 of a second shutter speed. And I'm gonna increase the power of the flash. And you see, I get a much brighter exposure for the doll head. And if I go down and lower the power of the flash, I get a darker exposure. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you found it useful and you learned how to control the exposure when you add a light, an extra light to your exposure triangle. If you liked it, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I'm posting a new video every Monday or Tuesday, so by subscribing you won't miss any of the future videos. If you have a question, any question about photography or videography, I'll be more than happy to answer them for you. And as usual, take good care, keep shooting. I see you soon. Cheers.